Hey guys, how are you doing? So this is the first video in a series of tutorial videos that I'm going to make about how to get a shot like this done. Obviously, the first step that you need in order to get a shot like this is to actually film it. And there are a couple of main concerns that you have when you're doing something like that. First of all, you want to have an image that has as little motion blur as possible. Now, motion blur, if you'll see when I shake my hand like this, if I freeze a frame, you'll notice that my hand is really blurry because it's moving really fast and the camera captures it as a blur. When you're doing a camera track, which is when you're telling your computer to extrapolate the camera movement based on the footage, motion blur is your greatest enemy. It isn't lens distortion. Computers can handle lens distortion very well. It's motion blur. So when you're filming something like that, keep your shutter speed really high. This is the footage that I got. The shutter speed there was 1/100. Normally you'd film 1/40 or 1/50. 1/100 is what I use because then I get as little motion blur as possible. You can always blur something. Blurring something is really easy. You can never sharpen something back. That's a lot more difficult. So get rid of your motion blur as much as possible. You'll notice if you go frame by frame, of course, there's still some motion blur, but most of it is out. Now, the second thing that is problematic is something called rolling shutter. Now, look at this footage. So if I freeze a frame, what you'll see is that the building is crooked. It's bent. It looks like it's made out of jello. The reason for that is that most cameras don't capture the image as a whole. They don't capture all pixels of the image at the same time. They just kind of go on a pattern like this through your image. This is called rolling shutter. There are some great videos about rolling shutter that I'm going to link over here, and that is a problem. That it's probably a bigger problem if you have it in extreme, so if you're shaking like this or something. That's probably a bigger problem for camera tracking than motion blur. This is something that you definitely want to avoid, and that's why I didn't use a phone. I'm recording with my phone now because my camera kind of gets unstable if I'm recording things that are too long. But for that, I used my DSLR, which is this right here. It's a Canon T6i. I recorded it at 24 frames a second. I recorded it at a shutter speed of 1/100. I used an aperture of f5.6. That means that my aperture, that the hole through which the light gets in, is really wide open. A lot of people would advise against that, and they have a point. Their point being it makes your footage blurrier, but it makes it consistently blurry. So if you have a spot and this spot is blurred by the wide aperture, it is going to be blurred the same amount no matter what. And that is, in my opinion, a lesser problem than having a lot of noise in your image, which is what would happen if I crank up my ISO to compensate. So I use an ISO of 200. I wouldn't recommend going above 400 for that camera at least. You gotta do some tests to see what's best for you. And I also shot it on overcast day to avoid harsh shadows, because if I have a lot of really high contrast in my image, the dynamic range of the camera could not cope with that, and then I can lose detail in the darks or in the whites. And the reason why losing detail is such a problem is the same reason why blurry footage is a lot of problem, because I need points that are easy to follow, so points of high contrast for my computer to follow along and use that information to extrapolate the camera motion. That's why the movement that I made, which is one of the easiest ways that you can shoot for a camera track, I pointed my camera at where I wanted my object to be, and I walked parallel to it, kind of like that. And what that does is it gives me a lot of points in the background that are moving at a very different rate than the points in the foreground, and that helps me extrapolate the camera movement. That helps the computer actually to extrapolate the camera movement a little bit better. I'm going to put a link to a tutorial by Ian Hoover that goes into a lot more detail, because Ian Hoover uses Blender much better than I do. But this is the meat of it. This is how I've configured this shot for it to look as good as possible. What else do I have to say? The high contrast. You can absolutely stand still and just point your camera around like this, but this is a different process to solve, mathematically speaking, for the computer. It's called a tripod solve, and it is a little bit more difficult to recreate the geometry of the scene. So that's why I'm doing it this kind of movement. If you're just going forwards, or if you're pointing at an area that doesn't have a lot of depth, that could be a problem. but it's still doable. On this shot here that I did for a music video, I definitely had a harder time tracking than I'm going to on this tutorial. This is basically all the information that you need. This is how I did to capture the footage as clearly as possible. Yeah, that's it. Get shooting, and I'll see you in the next video when we're gonna bring this footage over to my computer and pre-process it using DaVinci Resolve in a way that makes it easier for me to extract the camera movement in Blender. And by the way, you know the drill, you've been on YouTube before. If you like this kind of video and you want to see more of it, don't forget to like, share, subscribe. It really, really helps. Have a nice day. I'll see you in the next tutorial. Bye.